For nearly a century, 45,000 people in one place made every single telephone in America. Let that sink in. Every single one. If you picked up a receiver in the 20th century to say hello, call a doctor, or wish your mother a happy birthday, you were holding an object created right here. This wasn't just a factory. It was the absolute monopoly on the physical embodiment of human connection. The Western Electric Hawthorne Works complex occupied such a massive territory that it had its own railroad, its own power plants, a hospital, and even its own police force inside. This place became a shrine for every HR manager in the world. It was here in the 1920s that the famous Hawthorne effect was discovered. Here, it was scientifically proven for the first time that a worker is not a biological machine, but a human being who needs attention. It seemed they had found the secret code to perfect productivity and eternal happiness. But look at this footage from the mid-80s. The legendary water tower, the symbol of the plant, collapses under dynamite blasts. The industrial Versailles was wiped off the face of the earth. Today, on the site where the global science of management was created, stands a faceless shopping mall with a giant parking lot. 45,000 high-skilled jobs for engineers and mechanics turned into spots for supermarket cashiers and fast food clerks. Production that was considered eternal and strategically vital to U.S. national security vanished just a few years after the company lost its monopoly. Why couldn't the factory that was the first in history to care for the souls of its workers save their jobs? The answer is frighteningly simple. It turned out that perfect culture and eternal product quality can become a death sentence. If the market suddenly decides that cheap is more important than forever. This isn't just a story about business. This is a story about how politics, lawsuits, and the insatiable greed of the free market killed an industrial utopia that didn't fit into the age of plastic. To understand the scale of this loss, we need to transport ourselves to the beginning of the 20th century. At that time, the telephone was a miracle. It was the internet of its day. The network was growing at an explosive pace. Americans wanted to talk to each other. But there was one problem. Who would make all these phones? The giant AT&T, affectionately and fearfully called Ma Bell, owned all the communication lines, and they needed a manufacturing arm. They needed a super factory capable of satisfying the nation's insatiable appetite for conversation. In 1905, they chose a spot, a suburb of Chicago called Cicero. It was here, among fields and swamps, that Western Electric began building the most modern factory on planet Earth. They spared no expense. They built for the ages. Brick walls a meter thick, huge windows flooding the workshops with light. It was a city within a city. Hawthorne Works. The production philosophy here was radically different from today's. Today, it's profitable for a company if your phone breaks in 2 years, so you buy a new one. This is called planned obsolescence. But Ma Bell had a different logic. AT&T owned all the phones. Subscribers didn't buy the devices, they rented them. This meant that if a phone broke, AT&T paid for the repair. It was categorically unprofitable for them to have things break. Therefore, the task of Hawthorne Works engineers was simple and grand. Make things that will never break. It was the engineering of immortality. Every screw, every spring, Every contact in the phone was made with a safety margin like that of a spaceship. Western electric phones could be dropped on concrete, used to hammer nails, survive a flood, and they kept working. The factory was built as an autonomous state. They had their own fire department, ready to extinguish any blaze in minutes. They had their own hospital with the best doctors in Chicago. They had their own sports leagues, baseball, bowling, tennis. Their own Miss Hawthorne beauty pageants. Their own newspaper, read by more people than the city papers. Getting a job at Hawthorne Works was considered winning the lottery. It wasn't just a job, it was a guarantee. If you walked through the Hawthorne gates, you were set for life. You knew you would have a good salary, health insurance, and a decent pension. In the world of wild capitalism of the early century, this was an island of socialism and stability. In 1924, an event occurred that wrote the factory's name into history textbooks forever. Western Electric management was obsessed with efficiency. They wanted to squeeze the maximum out of their people, but they didn't want to use the whip. They wanted to use science. They invited a group of scientists from Harvard and MIT, including the famous Elton Mayo. The task was simple. Find out how physical conditions affect productivity. Will a worker assemble a relay faster if the lights in the shop are brighter? Or conversely, dimmer? Does temperature affect it? Humidity? The experiment began. Scientists selected a group of female assemblers, separated them from the rest, and began changing the lighting. They made the light brighter. Productivity went up. The scientists rubbed their hands. Aha! Light matters. But then, to verify, they made the light dimmer, almost like twilight. And what happened? Productivity went up again. The scientists were in shock. This contradicted physics and logic. They returned the light to normal. Productivity went up even more. They changed break times, changed the length of the workday. Every time they changed something, the women worked better. In the end, the scientists realized the truth. It wasn't about the light bulbs. It wasn't about the breaks. The women worked better simply because someone was paying attention to them. For the first time in their lives, managers weren't yelling at them, but asking their opinion. They were interested in them. They listened to them. They felt important. This phenomenon was named the Hawthorne effect. It was a discovery on the level of splitting the atom, only in psychology. For the first time, it was scientifically proven. A worker is not a biological machine into which you feed money to get parts. A worker is a complex personality. They need respect. They need a sense of belonging to a group. After this discovery, the factory turned into a laboratory of humanism. Western Electric created the world's first human resources (HR) department in the modern sense. They introduced coffee breaks. They shortened work shifts. They hired hundreds of psychologists who walked the floors and simply talked to people, listening to their complaints about life, wives, bosses. This program was called personnel counseling. Western Electric became the gold standard of an employer. They proved to the world that respect for a human being brings net profit, that a happy worker assembles phones better than a scared one. Part 3. Greatness, Black Brick, and War. World War II became a stress test. The Hawthorne Works plant instantly turned into a secret defense center. Telephones took a back seat. Now they made radar, radio equipment for tanks and planes, guidance systems. Half the employees went to the front. Their place at the machines was taken by women. Rosie the Riveter worked here in Cicero. These women assembled the most complex electronics with jeweler-like precision. Their fingers tied wire harnesses faster than the eye could follow. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The lights of Hawthorne never went out, becoming a symbol of American industrial might grinding down enemies. After the war came the true Golden Age, the era of the Model 500. You've all seen this phone, the famous black device with a rotary dial, heavy as a brick, smooth as a river stone. It was everywhere, in every home, in every office, in every movie of the 50s and 60s. Designer Henry Dreyfuss created a masterpiece of industrial design, but Hawthorne engineers made it immortal. Millions of these phones rolled out of the factory gates every year. It was an assembly line perfected. Quality was absolute. Defects were at the level of statistical error. This was the peak of corporate paternalism. Workers proudly called their factory the club or the hotel. It was more than a job. It was a lifestyle. They had a library with 20,000 books, more than in many towns. They had an evening school where a worker could get an engineering education for free. They had their own bank, credit union, that gave mortgages for houses. People didn't quit Hawthorne. Turnover was practically zero. Dynasties worked here. Grandfather brought father. Father brought son. It seemed this idyll would last forever, that Ma Bell would always take care of her children. Part 4. Signals of Change. The Golden Cage of Monopoly. But the problem lay in the very nature of their success. Western Electric was a monopoly. They didn't need to compete. They didn't need to fight for the customer. Their only customer was the parent company, AT&T. And AT&T was required by law to buy everything Western Electric produced. It was a golden cage. The lack of competition killed the survival instinct. The factory became sluggish, like an overfed cat. Bureaucracy grew to monstrous proportions. Any change in phone design, even replacing a screw, required the approval of dozens of committees and months of paperwork. The factory became incredibly expensive to maintain. Social programs, high wages, huge overhead costs. All this was built into the price of the phone. But as long as Ma Bell paid, no one cared. Meanwhile, the world was changing. The technological revolution began to overtake the giant. While Hawthorne Works took pride in its electromechanical relays and hand assembly, the world was moving to microchips and automation. Japanese and German companies began making electronics faster, cheaper, and smaller. Western Electric was stuck in the paradigm of eternal things. But people began to change. They no longer needed a phone that would last 50 years. They wanted a phone in a pretty color, lightweight, with buttons instead of a dial, with an answering machine. The philosophy of engineering immortality was becoming a burden in the era of disposable consumption. In the 1970s, the first cracks appeared in the foundation. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and courts began to dismantle AT&T's monopoly. For the first time in history, Americans were allowed to buy other brands of phones and plug them into the network. The market was flooded with cheap, plastic, cheerful phones from Asia. They broke in a year. They had bad sound. but they cost pennies and looked trendy. The heavy, black, eternal devices from Hawthorne began to look like dinosaurs, artifacts of a bygone era. Part 5. The Fall, the Shattered Empire. 1984 was the year of the apocalypse for Western Electric. The U.S. government, after long antitrust trials, made a historic decision: forced breakup of AT&T. The Ma Bell empire was smashed into several independent regional companies, Baby Bells. The unified system collapsed. For the Hawthorne Works plant, this was a death sentence. In one day, they lost their guaranteed buyer. Now, the new independent phone companies could buy equipment from anyone, from Siemens, from NEC, from Northern Telecom, and they started buying from them. Suddenly, a terrible truth was revealed. In the conditions of a free, harsh market, Hawthorne Works was absolutely unviable. Maintaining a huge complex of hundreds of acres, heating old workshops, social guarantees, high union wages, an army of managers. All this made their products too expensive. A phone made in Cicero cost 3 times more than the same phone made in Taiwan, or even at a new, modern factory in another state. Competitors, unburdened by the Hawthorne effect, history, and social responsibility, won on price in a shutout. The agony began. Mass layoffs. What used to be lifetime employment turned into a stream of pink slips. Every Friday, hundreds of people walked out the gates for the last time. The club atmosphere died instantly, replaced by panic, fear, and a struggle for survival. Workshops where life had bustled for decades emptied one by one. Machines stopped and were covered in dust. Windows were broken. The great factory didn't die from an explosion. It died from silence. Part 6. The Crash. Shopping Mall on Bones. In the mid-'80s, Western Electric, now renamed AT&T Technologies in an attempt to change its image, finally closed production in Cicero. The last switch was flipped. 40,000 people disappeared from the city's economy. The effect on the local community was comparable to a nuclear strike. The city of Cicero lost its heart, lungs, and wallet. Small businesses around the plant, cafes, barbershops, stores, went bankrupt in their wake. But the worst was yet to come. The new landowners decided that history took up too much space. They brought in bulldozers and dynamite. The famous water tower, which towered over the city like a lighthouse, was demolished, despite protests from locals and plant veterans. Red brick buildings, built so strongly they would have withstood a bombing, were destroyed by excavators. Dust from bricks that remembered Elton Mayo and the birth of management science settled on the ground. History was leveled to make room for America's new god, retail. On the site of the legendary factory, they built a shopping mall, Hawthorne Works Shopping Center, where engineers once created the most complex communication systems. Walmart checkout counters now stand. Where radar was assembled to win the war, they now flip burgers and sell cheap Chinese sneakers. Instead of high-paying jobs for engineers and mechanics, minimum wage jobs for clerks and security guards. Consumerism defeated creation. The only thing left is the name of the shopping center, a cynical reminder of what we lost. Part 7. Conclusion of the story. The story of Hawthorne Works is one of the bitterest ironies of the 20th century. The place where science first proved the importance of humane treatment of workers was destroyed by a market that views workers solely as an expense line in an Excel spreadsheet. The Hawthorne effect is taught today in every business college in the world. MBA students memorize that a happy worker is an efficient worker. But the factory itself that spawned this knowledge became a victim of cold financial optimization. It turned out that humanism costs money. And when the monopoly collapsed, no one wanted to pay for that humanism. The second lesson is the tragedy of the loss of quality. Western Electric made things for the ages. Their phones still work today, 70 years later. But the modern economy does not reward durability. It needs turnover. It needs trash. The world chose cheap plastic that needs to be replaced every year and planned obsolescence. We traded the philosophy of engineering perfection for the philosophy of buy, throw away. And the ruins in Cicero are a monument to this choice. And finally, this is a lesson for any corporation. Even the most perfect internal culture, the happiest employees, and the best cafeterias won't save you if your business model depends on an artificial monopoly. Comfort killed innovation. Ma Bell created greenhouse conditions for her children. But when the greenhouse glass was shattered by the hammer of the antitrust court, the happy workers found themselves defenseless against the icy wind of reality. The ideal was shattered by everyday life.